Hey, special educators. Welcome to Teach TaskBox Inspire, the podcast dedicated to making your job as a special education teacher easier by making your instruction more fun for you and your students. Inside each episode, you'll learn how to get the most use out of your task boxes in the classroom. I'm your host, Lisa Holiday from Chalkboard Superhero, a veteran special education teacher passionate about empowering you with purposeful teaching strategies, helpful tips and tricks, and other classroom management tools that will help you thrive in your role. Let's get started with today's episode. Hey there, special educators, and welcome back to another episode of Teach TaskBox Inspire. I'm your host, Lisa Holiday. Today's episode is one I've been wanting to do for a long time. It's a topic that, once I really understood it, changed the way I looked at student behavior, engagement, and even learning. We're talking about sensory processing and how it's not just a side issue or something that only affects a few students. It's the foundation of everything. If you've ever found yourself wondering, why is a student chewing on their shirt? Or why can't they just sit still? Or why do transitions completely derail my student's day? This episode is for you. Because here's the truth. When a student is dysregulated, they're not going to access learning the way we want them to. And if we don't recognize the role of sensory processing in that, we may end up treating the symptom, but not the root. So let's start with this. Sensory challenges are not bad behavior. Dysregulation is not defiance. And movement, fidgeting, and stimming aren't distractions. They're communication. In our schools, there's still a huge gap in training around sensory processing. Many Gen Ed teachers and even some behavioral analysts and administrators haven't been taught to understand sensory needs, and that leads to misinterpretations and missed opportunities. What we often see as non-compliance might actually be sensory overload. What we call attention seeking might actually be sensory seeking. And what we label aggression might be a fight or flight response to an environment that doesn't feel safe for that student. Understanding sensory needs helps us shift from what's wrong with that student to what does the student's body need in order to feel safe and ready to learn. That shift is everything. And I know I have some teachers listening to this podcast right now who are like, oh my God, Lisa, stop. That I can't hear one more person. I promise you guys, this is not like quote unquote gentle parenting. This is understanding a need. All right. So let's talk about the pyramid of learning, or some call it like the sensory pyramid. If you've never seen it before, picture a triangle with layered tiers, kind of like Maslow's hierarchy, but for sensory integration and learning. At the very base of this pyramid are foundational sensory systems. Tactile, which is just touch. Vestibular, which is movement and balance. Or proprioception, which is just kind of like your body awareness. And above that layer, you're going to see sensory motor development, which is like your balance, your motor planning, maybe your posture. You'll also see perceptual motor development, which is, your eye-hand coordination or just your visual perception. And only at the very, very tippy top do you get to cognition, attention, and academic learning. Let me say that again. Academics are at the very top small piece of the pyramid. If the bottom isn't solid, the top will always be shaky. This is why a student who is constantly falling out of their chair or chewing their sleeve or covering their ears or, crashing into furniture may struggle with reading. Not because they're not smart, but because their body is fighting to process the world around them. Let's talk about the 8 sensory systems. Yes, 8, not 5, not even 7, 8. Let's walk through them. Number 1, visual. What we see, right? Auditory, what we hear. Olfactory, what we smell. Gustatory, what we taste. I've always struggled with that word. Tactile, which is the touch or texture or temperature. Number 6 is vestibular, so balance or spatial orientation. 7 is proprioception, which is the muscle joint feedback, kind of where our body is in space. And 8, interoception, internal body signals like hunger, thirst, needing to go to the bathroom, pain, or emotional regulation. The last one is getting more attention lately, and rightfully so. If a student doesn't realize they're hungry, tired, or anxious, they can't self-advocate or regulate. Think about that in terms of meltdowns or task refusals or even toilet training delays. That last one matters. But you might be like, okay, Lisa, I'm not a diagnostician. That's okay. We're all the observers, and that's important too. So as teachers or even BCBAs, we're not diagnosing sensory processing disorder, and you shouldn't try to. This is the role of an occupational therapist, especially those trained in sensory integration. But just because we can't diagnose it doesn't mean we ignore it. We are on the front lines of observation. We spend more time with our students than almost anyone else. If we can learn the signs of sensory dysregulation, we can make referrals to OT. We can adjust our environment. We can choose more appropriate behavior interventions. We can even collaborate across all disciplinaries. So think of it this way. If a student has poor motor planning or extreme sensitivity to noise, a traditional token economy might not work until their body feels regulated. It's not about throwing out ABA. It's about layering it with sensory supports. Let's talk about examples, right? So example 1, a student screams every single time the fire alarm goes off, even when they know it's coming. They refuse to go back to class afterwards. That's an auditory sensitivity, not defiance. Another example is a student spins, crashing into walls, or pushing peers during unstructured time. That's likely vestibular or proprioceptive seeking, meaning they're trying to get the sensory input they're not getting otherwise. They're not meaning to push into other peers. Another example would be, a student is constantly needing to leave the classroom, but maybe they can't explain why. This could be that interoception, that last one. Maybe they don't recognize that they're anxious or overwhelmed until it's too late. But really, in all of these cases, we can respond with empathy and tools, not punishment and yelling at these students, right? Which is often what I see a lot. You might be saying, okay, Lisa, what can I do tomorrow? So here's a few starting points. Start a sensory journal. And I know some of you guys are rolling your eyes right now, but just jot down what you notice. When are behaviors happening? What came right before? Look for patterns. Sensory needs often show up as a consistency in the chaos. Number 2, adjust the environment. Try adding things like noise-canceling headphones, wiggle seats, some fidget options, movement breaks. Try dimming the lighting. Try setting up a quiet space or a sensory corner. Number 3, and this is important, collaborate with your OT. Reach out to your building's occupational therapist and ask if they can come observe or offer input. Many are thrilled when teachers take an interest in sensory integration. However, caveat here, you might have a very old OT in your building who not only does not like to come do observations, but they just don't have new and updated ideology when it comes to sensory integration. And sometimes you just ignore that and find other OTs that will help you with this. The last one I want to say is try layering sensory and behavioral supports. So use tools like token boards or schedules or reinforcement, but only when the student is in a in a regulated state. Behavior plans work better when paired with sensory accommodations. I know that is a lot, but sensory processing isn't like an extra thing. It's the foundation of how kids interact with the world. If a student isn't regulated, they're not available for learning, period. The sensory pyramid reminds us that academics are built on a much, much deeper base. When we ignore that base, we end up blaming kids for their behaviors that are really just nervous systems in distress. So as we plan behavior supports or academic interventions or classroom routines, let's bring sensory to the table. Let's partner with our OTs. Let's get curious before we get corrective. Because when we meet sensory needs first, everything else becomes a little easier. Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. I super hope it's helpful. Until next time, guys. Bye-bye. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Teach, TaskBox, Inspire. I hope you've gained some tips and motivation to fuel your week ahead. If you're ready to explore more strategies for empowering your students as independent learners, be sure to dive into my free training at chalkboardsuperhero.com/training. And don't keep all this knowledge to yourself. Share this episode with your special education teacher friends who could use some motivation and inspiration. One more thing before you go. If you're finding this podcast helpful and want to show support, head to Apple Podcasts and leave your rating and review. Until next time, keep teaching, taskboxing, and inspiring.